Did you know that the way you sleep, that cozy, uninterrupted 8-hour slumber, is a relatively new invention?
For our ancestors in the Middle Ages, the night was a completely different world, filled with strange routines and beliefs that would seem bizarre to us today.
Forget everything you know about getting a good night's sleep, because we're about to journey back in time to uncover the weird sleep habits of medieval people.
Welcome to the first chapter of our deep dive into the medieval night. Let's start with the biggest, most mind-blowing difference: segmented sleep. Imagine this. You go to bed around PM, just as dusk settles. You sleep for about 4 hours, and then, around AM, you wake up.
On purpose. This wasn't insomnia. It was the norm.
This first block of sleep was known as the first sleep or dead sleep.
So what did people do in the middle of the night? This waking period, lasting 1 to 2 hours, was a treasured, quiet time.
It was a unique window for productivity and reflection, free from the hustle and bustle of the day. The house would be quiet, the world outside dark and still.
For the deeply religious medieval society,
this was a prime time for prayer and spiritual contemplation. Many prayer books and devotionals from the era actually included specific prayers intended for this midnight interval. It was a sacred time to connect with God, away from worldly distractions.
But it wasn't all about prayer. This was also a practical time. You could stoke the fire to keep the house warm, check on the livestock, or do some quiet chores that didn't require much light, like mending clothes or preparing ingredients for the next day's meal. Scholars and writers often used this period of intense quiet to read, write, and study. The historian C. Roger Echurch, who pioneered this research, found countless references to this practice in letters, diaries, and literature from the period. For them, the silence of the night was a source of inspiration and concentration. This midnight hour was also a time for intimacy and connection.
For married couples, it was a private moment to be together.
It was believed to be the best time for conception, a belief supported by some medical texts of the day.
It was also a time to just chat with your bedfellows, and yes, I said bedfellows. We'll get to that in a moment.
You could have quiet conversations, share stories, or simply enjoy each other as company, before drifting off into what was called the second sleep, which would last until dawn.
This pattern of first and second sleep wasn't just a European thing.
It was common across many PI industrial cultures. So why did it disappear? The Industrial Revolution and the advent of artificial lighting changed everything. Streetlights and later, electric lights in homes pushed back the darkness and extended the day. The rigid schedules of factory work demanded a single, consolidated block of sleep.
By the early 20th century, the idea of a first and second sleep had almost completely vanished from our collective memory, dismissed by doctors as a sleep disorder rather than a natural historical pattern. Now, let's talk about where they slept.
The private bedroom is a modern luxury.
In medieval times, privacy was practically non-existent. Most people, especially in peasant households, lived in 1 or 2 room cottages.
The whole family, parents, children, and sometimes even grandparents or servants would sleep together in one room.
Often, they slept in one giant bed. This wasn't just a matter of saving space.
It was about warmth.
Central heating wasn't a thing.
Houses were drafty and cold, especially in winter. Huddling together was a simple and effective way to stay warm through the night.
This communal bed was often the most valuable piece of furniture in the house. It might be a simple wooden frame stuffed with a mattress of straw, rags, or if you were a bit wealthier, feathers or wool.
This mattress, or paillas, would be laid on a web of ropes.
You've heard the phrase, sleep tight, right? It likely comes from the need to periodically tighten these ropes to keep the mattress from sagging.
If the ropes were loose, you were in for an uncomfortable, lumpy night.
So, you're all piled into one bed, but it gets even cozier.
It wasn't uncommon for guests or travelers to join the family pile. An inn might have just a few large beds in a room, and you'd be expected to share with complete strangers.
It sounds incredibly awkward to us, but for them, it was completely normal.
There was a certain etiquette to bed sharing.
You'd try to keep to your side, and there were social rules about who slept where.
The head of the household might sleep in the middle for warmth and authority, or on the outside to protect the family.
Even the nobility, who had larger castles and more rooms, didn't have the same concept of privacy we do. A lord and lady would have their own bedchamber, but it was far from a private sanctuary.
It was often a semi-public space.
Trusted servants, ladies in waiting, or guards might sleep on smaller cots or truckle beds at the foot of their master as grand for poster bed.
The bedchamber was a hub of activity. where the Lord might receive visitors, conduct business, or even eat meals.
The idea of the bedroom as a purely personal, intimate space just didn't exist.
So, let's recap what we've learned in this chapter. Medieval people didn't sleep in one long stretch like we do. They had a first sleep, a waking period in the middle of the night for prayer, work, or socializing, followed by a second sleep, and they didn't sleep alone. Most people shared a bed, and often a single room, with their entire family, and sometimes even strangers, primarily for warmth and due to a lack of space. These practices might seem strange, but they were perfectly adapted to their world, a world without electric light, without central heating, and with a very different understanding of community and privacy.
What this tells us is that our natural way of sleeping isn't the only way.
It's a product of our modern environment. This is just the tip of the iceberg. In our next chapter, we'll explore what medieval people wore to bed or didn't wear, the strange and sometimes dangerous things they kept by their bedside, and the terrifying fears that haunted their night, from demons and ghosts to the very real threat of fire.
The medieval night was a fascinating and complex time, and we've only just begun to pull back the covers.
Ever wonder if you were a morning person or a night owl?
Well, medieval people were neither, they were both. We are diving deep into one of the most fascinating and bizarre aspects of their nightly routine, the two sleeps. Imagine this. You go to bed around PM, just as darkness fully blankets the world. You sleep for about 4 hours, then, around AM, you wake up. But you don't panic. You don't toss and turn, frustrated about being awake.
Instead, this is a normal, expected part of your night.
This period, known as the watch or dorveil in French, was a quiet, contemplative, and sometimes productive time.
It was an accepted part of the natural rhythm of life before artificial light changed everything.
So, what did people do during this 1 to 2 hour waking period in the middle of the night?
It wasn't about scrolling through social media, that's for sure. For the devout, this was a sacred time for prayer.
Many prayer books and devotionals from the period actually had special prayers designated specifically for the watch. It was a moment of profound spiritual connection in the stillness and silence of the night, when the rest of the world was asleep. It was a chance to reflect on your soul, your sins, and your relationship with God, uninterrupted. For the more scholarly or literary folks, this was prime time for reading and writing. The house would be quiet, distractions were minimal, and the mind was often surprisingly clear after that first sleep. Thinkers and writers would light a candle, pore over manuscripts, or jot down their thoughts. It was a golden hour for intellectual pursuits, a peaceful window carved out of the darkness. You could get some of your best work done when the daily hustle and bustle was a distant memory.
Of course, not everyone was praying or writing poetry.
For many, this was a practical time.
You might get up to stoke the fire, ensuring the house stayed warm through the rest of the cold night. You might use the chamber pot, check on a sleeping child, or even tend to a sick animal in the barn.
It was also a time for intimacy between couples.
In the privacy of the night, away from the crowded daytime life of a medieval household, this was a cherished moment for connection. Even doctors of the era had advice for this wakeful period.
They recommended that if you wanted to conceive a child, the best time to try was after the first sleep. They believed that couples would be more refreshed and that digestion from the evening meal would be complete, making for a better, more effective union. It's wild to think that medical advice was tailored around this sleep schedule. This wasn't just a niche habit for a few people.
It was the standard way of sleeping across Europe for centuries. We see references to first sleep and second sleep in all sorts of historical documents, from personal diaries and court records to medical texts and classic literature. In Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, for example, characters are described as waking up after their first sleep to go about their business before returning to bed. It was so common that nobody thought it was strange, it was just
sleep.
So what happened?
Why don't we sleep like this anymore? The big culprit was the Industrial Revolution, and more specifically, the widespread adoption of artificial lighting.
As cities brightened with gas lamps, and later, electric lights, our relationship with the night began to change.
Streets became safer, and social life could extend long after sunset. The pressure to conform to a more consolidated, efficient workday also grew. The factory whistle didn't care if you'd had your second sleep.
Suddenly, this natural, segmented sleep pattern began to be seen as inefficient and old-fashioned. A single, uninterrupted block of 8 hours became the new ideal.
People started going to bed later and forcing themselves to sleep through the night.
That middle of the night waking period Once a time for prayer or productivity became a source of anxiety.
We now call it insomnia. It's ironic, isn't it? What was once a normal part of the human sleep cycle is now considered a disorder.
Historian C. Roger Ekirch is the scholar who really brought this phenomenon to light.
He spent years combing through historical archives, finding hundreds of references to this biphasic sleep pattern. His work suggests that maybe, just maybe, our modern-day sleep problems aren't a malfunction of our bodies,
but rather a conflict between our natural biological clocks and the rigid schedules of modern life.
Our bodies might still be yearning for that quiet, wakeful pause in the middle of the night. So, the next time you find yourself wide awake at AM, don't stress. You're not broken. You might just be tapping into a deep, ancient sleep pattern that our medieval ancestors would have found completely normal. Maybe instead of fighting it, you could embrace it.
Say a little prayer, read a few pages of a book, or just enjoy the quiet.
You're participating in a last tradition.
And that's a wrap on the fascinating world of segmented sleep.
It really makes you think about how much our lives are shaped by technologies we take for granted.
Join us in the next chapter, where we'll uncover the secrets of medieval bedding.
Spoiler alert. It involves a lot more than just mattresses and pillows. You won't want to miss it.
Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey back in time, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the series.
See you next time. First, let's shatter a common myth. The image of a lone king in a vast private chamber is mostly a fantasy.
For the vast majority of people, privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford and didn't expect. Sleep was often a communal affair.
In a peasant's cottage, the entire family, parents, children, and maybe even a grandparent or two would huddle together in one room, and often in one large bed, to share body heat.
The floor was often just packed earth, maybe with some straw thrown down for a bit of insulation and comfort.
Now, let's climb the social ladder.
What about the wealthy? A lord's castle might seem grand, but the concept of a private bedroom was still developing. The lord and lady would have their own chamber, but it was far from a secluded sanctuary.
By day, it was a private living room, a place for receiving important guests, or even conducting business. By night, it transformed into a bedroom, but they were rarely alone.
Personal attendants, ladies in waiting, or trusted servants would often sleep in the same room. They might be on smaller truckle beds that rolled under the main bed during the day, or simply on pallets on the floor.
In a world of political intrigue and constant threats, having loyal guards sleeping at the foot of your bed wasn't paranoia. It was just common sense. They were a human alarm system and a first line of defense against any nighttime assassins.
Imagine trying to get a peaceful night's sleep, knowing someone might be plotting against you.
Suddenly, having a few armed guards in the room sounds pretty comforting, doesn't it?
Let's talk about the bed itself, the centerpiece of the medieval bedroom. For the rich, the four-poster bed wasn't just a piece of furniture.
It was a status symbol, a room within a room.
These beds were often massive, ornately carved creations made from heavy oak. But the most important feature was the curtains. These heavy drapes, often made of velvet or tapestry, weren't just for show. They served several crucial functions.
Castles and manor houses were notoriously drafty. Central heating was centuries away, and even a roaring fire in the hearth could keep the chill out of a large stone room.
Pulling the curtains closed created a small, insulated tent, trapping body heat and making sleep possible on a frigid winter night.
And thirdly, they helped keep out some of the less desirable roommates, and I'm not talking about the servants.
Pests were a constant problem.
Rats, mice, fleas, lice, and bedbugs were an accepted, if unpleasant, part of life. People tried all sorts of remedies. They would stuff their mattresses with aromatic herbs like lavender, chamomile, or wormwood, hoping to repel the critters.
The bedding itself was a layered affair.
The base would be a network of ropes, tightened to create a firm surface.
This is where the phrase sleep tight comes from. You literally had to tighten the ropes for a good night's sleep.
On top of that went a mattress, which for the wealthy might be stuffed with feathers or soft wool.
For the less fortunate, it was straw. And you can imagine how scratchy and lumpy that must have been. Now, what about the sounds and smells? Forget the quiet, serene bedroom of today.
A medieval town or castle was a noisy place. Even at night, you'd have the sounds of animals, dogs barking, chickens clucking, horses in the stables.
Inside the house, you'd have the snores, coughs, and movements of everyone else sleeping in the same room.
And the smells? Well, without modern sanitation, let's just say the air was thick with the odors of unwashed bodies, chamber pots, animals, and cooking smoke. Sleeping through all that required a level of adaptation we can hardly imagine.
The lighting, or lack thereof, also played a huge role.
Once the sun went down, the world became truly dark.
The primary source of light was fire, either the hearth or expensive candles made of beeswax for the rich, and smelly tallow for everyone else. But fire was a huge risk in houses made mostly of wood and thatch.
This profound darkness influenced their sleep patterns, tying them directly to the natural cycles of sunrise and sunset, something we explored in our episodes on segmented sleep.
The night was thought to be a time when the veil between worlds was thin, a time for demons and malevolent spirits.
This fear was another reason people preferred to sleep in groups, finding comfort and safety in shared company against the terrors of the night.
It was a communal, multifunctional, drafty, noisy, and often smelly space.
It was a room that prioritized security and warmth over privacy and comfort.
Yet, within these challenging conditions, people found a way to rest, to dream, and to wake up ready to face another medieval day.
It really makes you appreciate your quiet room, your comfy mattress, and your central heating, doesn't it?
So, picture this. You ray a medieval peasant after a long day of back-breaking labor in the fields.
What does your bed look like?
Well, for the vast majority of the population, the concept of a dedicated, private bed was a luxury they couldn't even dream of. Most people slept on the floor.
If they were lucky, they had a simple pallet, which was basically a thin mattress stuffed with whatever was available.
And when I say whatever, I mean whatever.
We're talking straw, hay, dried leaves, bracken, or even cattails.
And you would be 100% correct.
Not only was it itchy, but it was also a 5-star hotel for all sorts of creepy crawlers. Fleas, lice, and other bugs were constant bedfellows.
To combat this, people would occasionally try to air out their straw mattresses in the sun, hoping to drive some of the pests away, but it was a losing battle. Fresh straw was a luxury, and people would use the same stuffing for as long as possible, meaning it would get compressed, smelly, and even more bug-infested over time.
So, next time you complain about your mattress, just remember, at least it's not full of bugs and hay.
Your sleeping situation would be a definite upgrade. You might have a simple wooden frame for your bed. This was a huge step up, literally, as it got you off the cold, drafty floor. The mattress would still be stuffed with organic material, but you might have access to better quality stuffing like wool, feathers, or even horsehair.
These materials were softer, warmer, and less likely to host an entire ecosystem of insects. Instead of a single rough woolen blanket, you might have several layers. A linen sheet against your skin, which was much softer than wool, and then layers of woolen blankets and maybe even a fur-lined coverlet for those freezing medieval nights.
Remember, central heating was a fantasy, so piling on the blankets was the only way to stay warm. But the real sleeping superstars of the medieval period were, of course, the nobility. The beds of kings, queens, and high-ranking lords were something else entirely.
We're talking about the famous great beds.
The Great Bed of Ware, for example, which you can still see in a museum in London, is over 10 feet wide. They were typically made of oak, elaborately carved with family crests, religious scenes, or intricate patterns.
This wasn't just for show, although it was definitely a way to flaunt wealth.
The canopy, or tester, was designed to stop things from falling on you from the ceiling like dirt, dust, or the occasional rat. And the thick, often velvet or brocade curtains provided privacy and, more importantly, warmth.
When you drew those curtains, you created a small, enclosed room within a room that trapped your body heat.
It was the medieval equivalent of a personal heating system.
We're talking a thick feather bed, sometimes several of them stacked on top of each other, all resting on a web of ropes attached to the bed frame. These ropes needed to be tightened regularly to prevent sagging, which is where the old saying "sleep tight" comes from.
A servant would use a special tool, a bed key, to tighten the ropes, ensuring their master had a firm, comfortable surface to sleep on.
On top of the feather bed would be the finest linen sheets, wool blankets, and coverlets made of silk or trimmed with exotic furs like ermine.
But what about pillows? Today we have memory foam and cooling gel. In the medieval period, pillows were a bit different. For the poor, a pillow might be a log, a rock, or just a wadded-up bundle of their own clothes.
The wealthy, however, had pillows that matched their beds in luxury.
They were stuffed with soft down feathers and encased in fine linen or silk.
But here's a weird twist. Sometimes people used hard pillows made of wood or even stone. These were often carved to cradle the neck and were believed to support the head in a healthier position, supposedly to prevent a double chin or to protect elaborate hairstyles, especially for women of the court. Could you imagine trying to get comfortable on a wooden block? It gives a whole new meaning to sleeping like a log. Now, let's talk about what people kept near their beds.
No bedside tables with charging ports and books, of course, but people did keep important items close. One of the most common was a chamber pot, since the toilet, or wardrobe, was often a long, cold walk away, sometimes even located outside the main building. Having a pot under the bed was a necessity for those middle-of-the-night emergencies. A servant would have the unenviable task of emptying it in the morning.
Another crucial bedside item, especially for the wealthy, was a chest or coffer.
This was the medieval equivalent of a safe. Remember, bedrooms were not private spaces.
Servants, family members, and visitors were constantly coming and going. People stored their most valuable possessions, money, jewelry, important documents, and fine clothes in a locked chest, which was often kept right at the foot of or beside the bed.
This way, they could literally sleep on their fortune, keeping a close eye on it.
Some even used these chests as a step to get into their high beds.
And for personal safety, it wasn't uncommon for men, and even some women, to sleep with a weapon within arm's reach. This could be a dagger, a knife, or even a sword, slipped under the mattress or hung on the bedpost.
In a time of political instability and frequent violence, you never knew when you might need to defend yourself, even in your own bedchamber. It's a stark reminder of how different their world was from ours. Finally, a common item found in many medieval bedrooms, rich or poor, was some form of religious artifact.
This could be a small wooden cross, a rosary, or an icon of a saint.
Religion was woven into the fabric of daily life, and the vulnerability of sleep was a time when people felt particularly in need of divine protection.
Saying prayers before sleep and upon waking was a standard ritual, and having a holy object nearby was a source of comfort and a way to ward off evil spirits, which many people genuinely believed could harm them in their sleep. So, from a bark-infested pile of straw on a dirt floor to a magnificent curtained fortress of a bed, the sleeping arrangements of the medieval period were a direct reflection of one's place in the world. It was a world where comfort was a privilege, privacy was a rarity, and a good night's sleep was something you had to work for and protect.
You've had a long day of, I don't know, tilling the fields or maybe jousting, and you're ready to hit the hay.
You walk into your chamber, and what do you see? Not the cozy, private bedroom we're used to.
For most people in the Middle Ages, especially those who weren't fabulously wealthy, sleeping was a communal affair. We touched on this before, but let's really get into the nitty-gritty of it. The master of the house and his wife might have a bed, often in the main hall where everyone else gathered.
This bed was a status symbol. It was big, often ornate, and might even have a canopy.
But here's where it gets interesting.
This grand bed wasn't just for two. It was common for the entire family, including children, to pile in together. Think of it as a giant, human-sized nest.
It was practical, really. More bodies meant more warmth, which was crucial in drafty medieval homes without central heating.
But it wasn't just family.
If you had guests over, you wouldn't show them to a spare room.
You'd invite them right into your bed.
Hospitality meant sharing everything, including your sleeping space. It was a sign of trust and welcome. Can you imagine bringing a friend home and saying, "Right, just hop in with me and my spouse"?
It's a level of closeness that's almost unimaginable to us today.
For those lower down the social ladder servants, apprentices, or the poor, the situation was even more communal. They wouldn't have a bed at all.
Instead, they'd sleep on the floor of the great hall, on straw pallets or simple mattresses stuffed with whatever was available, like wool or feathers.
They'd huddle together for warmth. A whole group of people sharing a single, large sleeping area.
Privacy, as we know it, simply wasn't a concept that applied to sleep.
Your sleeping companions could be your family, your co-workers, and even complete strangers if you were staying at an inn.
It was a world where personal space was a luxury few could afford. Now, let's talk wardrobe. What did people wear to bed?
Our modern image of pajamas, nightgowns, or even just old t-shirts is, well, completely modern.
For the vast majority of medieval society, the answer to "what did you wear to bed?"
was simple: nothing. That's right. Most people slept completely in the bath. This might sound shocking, but it was the norm across all social classes for centuries. Why? Well, for one, clothing was expensive.
Every garment was handmade, a process that took a lot of time and resources.
You wouldn't want to waste a perfectly good tunic by sleeping in it. Clothes were for wearing during the day, to protect you from the elements and to show your status. At night, tucked under layers of blankets or furs, there was simply no need for them.
It was practical. Plus, sleeping without clothes was likely more comfortable and hygienic than sleeping in the same dusty, sweaty clothes you'd worn all day.
Laundering clothes was a major chore, so keeping them clean was a priority. There are countless medieval illustrations called illuminations in manuscripts that depict people in bed, and overwhelmingly,
it wasn't seen as scandalous or improper. It was just how people slept.
Of course, there were exceptions. The very wealthy might have owned a special garment for sleeping, a sort of simple linen shift or shirt, which was a precursor to the nightgown. But this was rare. For the average person, your birthday suit was your sleep suit.
However, as the Middle Ages progressed, particularly into the later period around the 15th century, ideas began to shift. A sense of modesty started to creep into the bedroom. This is when we begin to see the emergence of the nightshirt for men and the night chemise for women, primarily among the upper classes.
These were usually long, simple garments made of linen. They offered a bit more warmth and, more importantly, a bit more modesty in those still very communal sleeping environments. If you had to get up in the night, you weren't completely exposed.
Interestingly, this change was also tied to emerging ideas about health and hygiene. Some medieval physicians believed that sleeping in a light garment could help regulate body temperature and protect against bad air or miasmas, which they thought caused disease.
So, the nightgown wasn't just about being shy.
It was also an early form of preventative medicine.
It was a status symbol, a nod to modesty, and a health trend all rolled into one. But even with the rise of the nightgown, the practice of sleeping nude continued for a long time, especially among the common folk.
It was cheap, easy, and comfortable. It's a stark reminder of how much our daily habits, even something as personal as sleep, are shaped by the technology, economy, and social values of our time. The idea of dedicated sleepwear is a relatively recent invention in the grand scheme of human history.
So, let's recap this chapter's weirdness. We have entire families plus guests snuggling up in one bed.
We have servants and travelers sleeping in a pile on the floor. And we have almost everyone doing it with absolutely no clothes on.
It paints a picture of medieval life that is incredibly different from our own. One that was far more communal and far less private. The bed was not a personal sanctuary, but a shared, social space. And what you wore, or didn't wear, was a matter of pure practicality and economics, not personal preference or style. It really makes you appreciate your private room and your comfy pajamas, doesn't it? The next time you climb into bed, think of your medieval counterparts and be grateful you don't have to share your pillow with your boss or a traveling merchant. We're diving deep into something that might surprise you, the medieval relationship with dreams and nightmares.
You see, for people in the Middle Ages, dreams weren't just random brain activity. They were messages, omens, and sometimes even divine interventions. When a medieval person woke up from a vivid dream, they didn't just shake it off and make coffee. They analyzed it.
They consulted with religious figures, or even looked up its meaning in one of the many dream books that circulated at the time.
These weren't like the dream dictionaries you find online today.
Medieval dream books, or somnial, were serious business.
Dreaming of flying might mean you were about to receive an honor. Dreaming of losing a tooth, a classic anxiety dream for us, was often interpreted as a warning about the death of a relative.
It was a complex system of symbolism that they took very seriously.
For example, dreaming of clear water was a good sign, while muddy water foretold trouble. A dream about a bountiful harvest could predict prosperity, while a dream of a fire might signal a coming conflict or illness. This belief was rooted in both religious texts and ancient traditions.
The Bible is full of significant dreams, from Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams in Egypt to angels visiting people in their sleep.
So, for a devout medieval Christian, a dream could very well be a direct communication from God, a saint, or, on the flip side, a temptation from the devil. This made the dream world a spiritual battleground.
A pleasant dream might be seen as a sign of divine favor, while a disturbing one could be a warning to pray more and be more vigilant against sin.
But what about nightmares?
Oh, they had those too, but they didn't blame them on stress or that extra large helping of pottage before bed.
Nightmares were often seen as the work of malevolent supernatural beings.
Demons, incubi, and succubi were believed to visit people in their sleep, to torment them, tempt them, or even physically harm them.
One of the most feared was a creature known as the mare, from which we get the word nightmare. This entity was thought to sit on a sleeper's chest, causing feelings of paralysis and suffocation, a phenomenon we now call sleep paralysis.
To protect themselves from these nocturnal terrors, medieval people had a whole arsenal of spiritual and superstitious defenses. They would pray before bed, of course, asking for protection from evil spirits. But they also employed more practical, folk magic methods.
Placing a knife or a Bible under your pillow was a common practice.
The iron of the knife was thought to repel evil spirits, while the holy book offered divine protection.
Others might hang herbs like SD, John's wort, which was believed to have protective properties, around their bed or windows.
They would also sleep with religious objects, like a crucifix or a rosary, clutched in their hands.
It was like creating a spiritual fortress around their bed every single night. This intense focus on the spiritual and supernatural meaning of sleep shows just how different their worldview was from ours. For them, the boundary between the waking world and the dream world was incredibly thin. Sleep wasn't just a physical necessity.
It was a journey into a mystical realm, filled with both divine messages and demonic threats. Every night was an adventure, and what you experienced in your dreams could have real-world implications for your fate, your health, and your soul. It adds a whole new layer of meaning to the phrase, "sweet dreams," doesn't it?
They were actively trying to ensure their dreams were, in fact, sweet and holy, and not a terrifying encounter with the forces of darkness.
This brings us to another fascinating aspect, the interpretation of dreams within the community. If a king or high-ranking noble had a significant dream, it wasn't a private matter. It could be interpreted as a prophecy for the entire kingdom. Chronicles from the period are filled with accounts of rulers' dreams and the frantic attempts of their advisors to decode them. A dream could influence a decision to go to war, to sign a treaty, or to build a cathedral.
It was a form of intelligence gathering, sourced directly from the supernatural. This meant that the person who could interpret dreams held a position of considerable influence and power within the court.
So, while we might wake up and Google, what does it mean to dream about my teeth falling out?
Our medieval ancestors were consulting priests and poring over ancient texts, believing their very future, and the future of their community, could hang in the balance. It was a world where the subconscious was seen as a direct line to the cosmos. That's all for this chapter.
We've seen that for medieval people, closing their eyes at night was the beginning of a spiritual and psychological journey.
In our next chapter, we'll be exploring the noises of the medieval night. Trust me, it was anything but silent. This is chapter 6 of our series on the weird sleep habits of medieval people. If you've missed the previous chapters, be sure to check them out.
We've covered everything from segmented sleep to the bizarre beds they used.
Today, we are pulling back the velvet curtains on a topic that is both intimate and intensely practical. What did medieval people wear to bed?
Or more accurately, what didn't they wear? You might be picturing cozy flannel nightgowns or long, flowing nightshirts, but for the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, the answer is surprisingly simple. They wore nothing at all. That's right. Sleeping in the bath was the norm.
From the poorest peasant to the wealthiest lord, most people simply shed their daily clothes and slipped between the sheets, or onto their straw pallets in their birthday suits. Why was this so common? Well, for a start, clothing was incredibly valuable and labor-intensive to produce. Every thread was spun by hand, every piece of cloth woven on a loom. A simple tunic represented hours, if not days, of work. Subjecting these precious garments to the wear and tear of a night's sleep, with all the tossing and turning, just wasn't practical. Your day clothes were for the day. You take them off, fold them carefully, or hang them up to air out, and that was that.
Furthermore, dedicated sleepwear as a concept simply didn't exist for most of the medieval period. The idea of having a separate outfit just for sleeping was a luxury few could even imagine, let alone afford. It wasn't until the very late Middle Ages, around the 15th century, that the nightshirt or nightgown started to appear among the super rich, the highest echelons of the nobility.
For them, it was another way to display their immense wealth and status.
Owning an extra garment made of fine linen, worn only in the privacy of your bedchamber, was the ultimate status symbol.
But for everyone else, sleeping naked had its own logic. Think about hygiene. People didn't bathe as frequently as we do today, and their clothes would absorb the sweat and grime of a long day's work.
Sleeping without those clothes allowed their skin to breathe and kept the garments themselves cleaner for longer.
It also made dealing with nighttime pests, like lice or fleas, a bit more straightforward.
It is easier to spot and deal with unwanted guests on bare skin than when they lay hiding in the folds of your clothing.
Now, you might be thinking, weren't they cold? And that is an excellent question.
Medieval castles and cottages were notoriously drafty and difficult to heat.
This is where the bedding came into play.
We talked about this in a previous chapter, but it bears repeating. They relied on layers. People would pile on woolen blankets, furs, and heavy coverlets. They also had bed curtains, which weren't just for privacy. They were essential for trapping body heat and creating a warmer microclimate around the bed.
And don't forget, they often shared beds, so the body heat of your family members, or even your servants, would help keep everyone warm. The emergence of the nightshirt towards the end of the period is a fascinating story in itself. It started with the very wealthy men. A long, loose-fitting shirt often made of fine, white linen.
It was a signal that you were so rich you could afford to dedicate a whole piece of expensive fabric to an activity you did in private.
Women's nightgowns, or chemises din nuit, followed a similar pattern.
These early forms of sleepwear were often elaborately decorated with embroidery, a clear statement of luxury.
These garments were also linked to changing ideas about modesty and privacy,
which was slowly evolving among the upper classes.
As the wealthy began to value a greater sense of personal space, having a garment to wear when you weren't fully dressed, but not yet in your day clothes, became more desirable.
Imagine a king or queen being woken in the middle of the night.
They would want something to throw on quickly to receive a messenger. The nightshirt served that purpose. For the common person, though, this was all a world away.
They continued to sleep as their ancestors had for centuries. Naked, under a pile of whatever coverings they could afford, huddled together for warmth.
Their daily tunic, their most important piece of clothing, would be waiting for them to put on as soon as the sun rose and it was time to face another day.
It's a stark contrast to our modern world, where we have entire wardrobes dedicated to sleepwear, from silk pajamas to cozy onesies. The medieval approach was born out of pure practicality and economic necessity. It reminds us that so many things we take for granted today were once unimaginable luxuries. Sleeping naked wasn't a choice.
It was simply the way things were done.
So next time you put on your favorite pajamas, take a moment to appreciate the comfort and choice you have.
The simple act of putting on a special outfit for bed is a modern luxury that our medieval ancestors would have found completely baffling, and perhaps even a little bit wasteful. Ever wonder what a medieval person's version of a lullaby was? Well, it probably wasn't a lullaby at all, but something far more practical, even a bit grim.
Welcome back to our series on the weird sleep habits of medieval people.
In this 7th chapter, we're diving into the sounds, smells, and security measures that defined a medieval night.
Let's start with the soundscape.
Forget the gentle hum of a white noise machine.
A medieval night was a symphony of natural and not so natural sounds.
In the countryside, you'd hear the rustling of animals, the hooting of owls, and the howl of the wind. In a town, it was a different story.
The cry of the night watchman marking the hours, the distant clang of a blacksmith working late, the barking of dogs, and yes, the occasional drunken argument spilling out of a tavern.
Silence was rare.
People were accustomed to this constant background noise.
It was the soundtrack of their lives, and its absence might have been more alarming than its presence. Now, let's talk about smells.
Our modern noses would probably be overwhelmed.
Without modern sanitation, the air, especially in towns, was thick with the smell of livestock, waste, wood smoke, and unwashed bodies. Inside the home, things weren't much better. Herbs like lavender, chamomile, and meadowsweet were often strewn on the floor or placed in sachets among the bedding.
This wasn't just for a pleasant aroma.
It was a desperate attempt to mask the pervasive odors, and, they believed, to ward off pests and even disease, which was thought to travel on bad air, or miasma. So, your medieval bed might have looked rustic, but it smelled like a very potent potpourri fighting a losing battle against the reality of medieval life.
Security was another massive concern that dictated sleeping arrangements. Remember the communal beds we talked about? They weren't just for warmth.
They were for safety in numbers. A lone sleeper was a vulnerable sleeper. Doors were barred, windows were shuttered, and in wealthier households, a servant might even sleep on the floor at the foot of their master's bed as a human alarm system and bodyguard.
The fear of robbery, fire, or worse was very real.
You didn't just go to sleep.
You fortified your position for the night.
The act of barring the door was a crucial final step in the nightly ritual, a symbolic and practical barrier against the dangers lurking in the darkness.
This brings us to a fascinating concept, the first sleep and second sleep, which we've touched on before.
That period of wakefulness in the middle of the night wasn't just for praying or pondering. It was also a prime time for vigilance. It was an opportunity to check on the fire to make sure it hadn't gone out or spread, to listen for any unusual sounds outside, to ensure the children or livestock were safe.
It was a built-in security check.
Imagine waking up at 1 a.m.
Not to scroll through your phone, but to do a security sweep of your house and property. It paints a very different picture of the night. Furthermore, let's consider the psychological aspect.
Sleep was not seen as a gentle escape, but as a state of vulnerability. Religious beliefs played a huge role here.
People would pray fervently before bed, asking for protection from not just physical threats, but spiritual ones.
They believed demons and evil spirits were most active at night. The darkness held a tangible terror that we, with our electric lights, can barely comprehend. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner, could be interpreted as something malevolent. A crucifix or a religious icon by the bed wasn't just decoration. It was spiritual armor. This constant low-level fear must have had a profound impact on the quality of their rest. Sleep was a necessary surrender, but one made with a great deal of trepidation. Even the position in which people slept was sometimes dictated by a mix of practicality and superstition. While we now know that sleeping on your back, front, or side is a matter of personal comfort, medieval medical advice often had strong opinions. For instance, some believed sleeping on your right side aided digestion, while sleeping on your back could lead to nightmares or even demonic possession, as it left the body to open and vulnerable.
It's a world where every aspect of life, even the unconscious act of sleeping, was governed by a complex web of belief, fear, and practical necessity. So, the next time you fluff your pillow in your quiet, climate-controlled, securely locked room, spare a thought for your medieval counterparts.
Their nights were a constant negotiation with noise, smells, and fear. Sleep wasn't a peaceful retreat. It was a guarded state of being, an 8-hour-long vigil split into two halves.
It's a testament to human adaptability that they managed to get any rest at all.
So far, we've busted the myth of the 8-hour sleep, explored segmented sleep, and looked at everything from shared beds to strange bedtime rituals.
But what about the end of the night?
How did medieval people actually wake up?
Forget your gentle phone alarm or the smell of brewing coffee.
For most, the day started with the loud, insistent clang of a church bell. The matins bell, often rung well before sunrise, was the communal alarm clock for entire towns and villages.
It called the devout to prayer, but it also signaled to every farmer, baker, and artisan that it was time to get to work. Imagine your entire neighborhood waking up to the same unavoidable sound.
And what was the very first thing they did upon waking?
For many, it wasn't stretching or yawning, it was prayer. Religion was deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, and starting the day with a prayer or a sign of the cross was as routine as putting on your shoes.
This was a moment to give thanks for surviving the night, a very real concern in an era of disease, fires,
and other dangers, and to ask for protection for the day ahead. It was a spiritual reset button pressed before the day's labor even began. Now, let's talk about the environment they woke up in. We imagine cozy, rustic cottages, but the reality was often less romantic.
Homes were frequently cold, dark, and smoky.
Before getting out of bed, a person's first task was often to get the fire going again.
If the embers from the previous night had died out, this was a difficult chore, involving striking flint and steel to catch a spark. This wasn't just for warmth.
It was essential for cooking the first meal of the day, which, for many, was a simple pottage or piece of bread. So, your first waking moments were spent battling the cold and dark.
What about those in castles or manor houses?
Did they have it easier? Well, yes and no. A lord or lady might be woken by a servant, who would arrive to open the heavy shutters, tend to the fire, and bring them a basin of water for washing.
This was a luxury, for sure, but even for the wealthy, privacy was a foreign concept.
Servants were constantly coming and going, so the idea of a quiet, personal morning routine simply didn't exist.
Your getting ready process was often a semi-public event.
Let's consider another fascinating aspect: dreams.
How did medieval people interpret their dreams upon waking? In our modern world, we often dismiss dreams as random brain activity, but in the Middle Ages, dreams were taken very seriously. They were seen as potential prophecies, messages from God, or temptations from demons.
People would often discuss their dreams with family or a priest, trying to decipher their meaning.
A dream about a bountiful harvest could be seen as a good omen, while a nightmare might be a warning of impending doom.
There were even dream books that offered interpretations for common dream symbols, much like the ones we see today, but with a much heavier spiritual weight. Waking up wasn't just about entering the physical world, but also about making sense of the spiritual messages received during the night.
And what about hitting the snooze button?
Was there a medieval equivalent?
Not really. For the vast majority of people, your work was tied to daylight.
If you were a farmer, you needed to be in the fields as soon as there was enough light to see.
If you were a blacksmith, your customers were waiting.
Lying in bed was not an option. It meant losing precious work time and therefore losing income.
The urgency to rise was driven by pure necessity. The sun, the church bell, and an empty stomach were the most effective motivators you could imagine.
But here's a twist that brings it all together. Remember our discussion on segmented sleep?
That first sleep and second sleep, the waking period in the middle of the night, known as the watch, was a quiet, contemplative time. But the waking period in the morning was the complete opposite. It was a sudden, communal, and action-oriented transition from rest to labor. The entire rhythm of society was built around this shared schedule.
When the bell rang, the whole world seemed to spring to life at once.
This created a powerful sense of community and shared purpose that is hard for us to imagine in our individualized modern lives. Let's not forget about health.
Morning routines often included a visit to the privy or chamber pot, but medical beliefs of the time also influenced morning habits.
For instance, the theory of the four humors was dominant. Waking up feeling groggy or unwell might be interpreted as an imbalance of your humors, perhaps too much phlegm.
A common remedy might be to clear your throat forcefully or drink a specific herbal infusion believed to rebalance your system.
Your first thoughts upon waking might not just be, "I'm tired," but "which of my humors is out of whack today?"
So, as we close this series, let's reflect. From segmented sleep and communal beds to waking with the church bells and interpreting divine messages in dreams, medieval sleep was a profoundly different experience.
It was less private, more communal, and deeply connected to religion, work, and survival. It wasn't about optimizing performance or getting a perfect 8 hours.
It was a natural rhythm dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the needs of the community. Thinking about their world really puts our own sleep habits into perspective, doesn't it?
Our anxieties about getting enough sleep might seem a little strange to someone from the 14th century.
Perhaps the biggest lesson we can take from our medieval ancestors is to be a little more in tune with our natural cycles and a little less stressed about the numbers on our sleep tracking apps.
Thank you so much for sticking with me through all 8 chapters of this series. It has been an absolute pleasure exploring this topic with you. If you've enjoyed this journey into the past, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss what we have coming up next.
We love digging into history's hidden corners, and we'd love for you to join us for future adventures.
Thanks again for watching.